The sky shuddered with a terrifying roar as the colossal warships of the Galactic Overlords tore through Earth's atmosphere. Sunlight vanished, swallowed by the metallic darkness as towering war machines, gleaming with cold steel, descended upon the blue planet like a living nightmare. These conquerors of hundreds of worlds now set their sights on Earth, a target they deemed insignificant, a mere trifle. But they never imagined that, deep within the shadows of an ancient forest, a lone soldier waited, ready to turn their nightmare into reality. The sky trembled with a horrifying roar as the massive warships of the Galactic Overlords ripped through Earth's atmosphere. The sound was unlike anything humanity had ever heard, a grinding cacophony of metal scraping against metal, mingled with the howling wind whistling through the gaps of a gargantuan machine, as if the universe itself were bellowing in rage. These ships, each stretching kilometers long, hovered in the sky like metallic phantoms, their outer hulls shimmering with frigid steel that distorted the sunlight into warped, grotesque reflections. Natural light was snuffed out entirely, plunging Earth into an artificial shroud of darkness, as though the apocalypse had arrived without a whisper of warning. The great cities, once symbols of human progress, were reduced to faint silhouettes beneath the hulking shadow of the alien fleet. The Galactic Overlords were no ordinary invaders. They were towering beings, each standing 3 times the height of a human, their bodies encased in living armor, a strange material as hard as steel yet as pliable as flesh, regenerating after every wound. Their eyes glowed a searing red, like molten forges in the dark, devoid of any emotion save cold contempt. Their faces were engineered for terror. No nose, no mouth, just deep, hollow eye sockets and angular features chiseled from icy stone. They had no need for spoken words with humanity. They communicated intent through action, through the overwhelming might of their technology and unrelenting cruelty. Before setting foot on Earth, they had subjugated 87 worlds, reducing vibrant planets to ash and eternal silence. Each victory was a declaration. Nothing in this universe could halt their advance. When they landed, the ground quaked violently, as if Earth itself groaned in agony. Their towering war machines, dubbed Warforgers, stepped from the ships with thunderous clanks, each footfall cracking the earth and leaving fissures stretching dozens of meters. These were more than mere tools of combat. They were icons of absolute domination, armed with weapons beyond human comprehension. Energy cannons mounted on their shoulders unleashed blazing blue beams, each capable of piercing the thickest human steel like it was tissue paper. A single shot could level a skyscraper, reducing it to a cloud of dust and smoke in an instant. Tanks, fighter jets, even humanity's mightiest fortresses crumbled before this power. The first cities to fall, New York, Tokyo, collapsed swiftly, leaving behind smoldering ruins and cries that faded into the wind. To the Galactic Overlords, Earth was no challenge. They saw it as a petty plaything, a light exercise before moving on to grander targets across the galaxy. In their eyes, humans were frail, backward creatures, unworthy of concern. They offered no negotiations, no ultimatums. They simply attacked, with the confidence of beings who had never tasted defeat. Their strategists, concealed within command ships hovering in the stratosphere, had mapped out the invasion with chilling precision. They divided Earth into sectors, deploying forces to sweep away all resistance within days. They believed nothing on this planet could slow their march, let alone stop it. Yet, as the Galactic Overlords focused on annihilating the sprawling urban centers, they overlooked a small but perilous detail, a remote outpost nestled deep in the northern wilderness. Far from the glow of city lights or the clamor of modern civilization. Nearly forgotten, half buried in the earth, it was surrounded by towering ancient trees and a thick veil of mist. Inside, a soldier named Kane sat silently before an outdated console, its dim screen casting faint light across his scarred face. Marcus was no longer part of Earth's regular military. He'd abandoned it 5 years ago after a catastrophic mission on an alien frontier, where he lost his entire squad. Since then, he'd chosen a life of solitude, cut off from the world, with only a crackling radio and haunting memories for company. He hadn't sought war, but war had found him. When an SOS signal crackled through the radio from the nearest city, a panicked officer's voice cut off by screams and the clang of metal, Marcus froze. The message was fragmented, But clear enough, Earth was under attack by an enemy unlike anything humanity had faced. For a few seconds, he sat motionless, a muscle twitching in his jaw, his calloused hands clenching into fists. His deep blue eyes, dulled by years of weariness, sparked with a cold resolve. He rose, slow but steady, like an old machine grinding back to life. Marcus no longer wore a uniform, bore no insignia or rank, but a soldier's instincts still coursed through his veins to protect, to fight, to survive. Stepping outside the outpost, he gazed up at the pitch-black sky where the Galactic Overlords' ships loomed like arrogant gods. A chill wind swept through the forest, carrying the distant scent of smoke and metal. They thought Earth was theirs, that humanity was just a swarm of insects awaiting the crush. But they didn't know Marcus Kane. They didn't know that, in the shadows of this forest, a lone man was preparing to turn their hubris into the greatest mistake of their conquests. He had no army, no cutting-edge weapons, just an old rifle, a handful of homemade gadgets, and a will of steel nothing could break. The Galactic Overlords might have conquered 87 worlds, but Earth would teach them that true strength lay not in technology or numbers, but in the spirit of a human who refused to yield. Marcus returned to the outpost, giving his gear a final check. He knew this war wouldn't end in a day, but he also knew it started here, with him. The Overlords thought they held everything in their grasp. They were wrong, and Marcus would prove it, step by step, until Earth's sky shone with sunlight again, not through surrender, but through victory. Marcus Kane had no advanced war machines or legions at his back. His arsenal was a weathered M17 rifle, a relic from decades past when humanity's armies still relied on bullets over energy blasts, its barrel worn smooth from thousands of shots, yet still a trusty companion through years of battle. Alongside it, he carried a few improvised tools, a coil of thin, razor-sharp steel wire, a handful of small mines crafted from explosives he'd stockpiled at the outpost, and a 20-centimeter dagger with a gleaming black steel blade. A constant extension of his body. This wasn't a stockpile to make the Galactic Overlords tremble, at least, not by their measure of power. But Marcus possessed something they could never quantify, the resilience of a man forged in adversity, who'd learned to survive when the odds were stacked against him. On the first night after the SOS cut out, Marcus stood in the forest's darkness, his keen eyes scanning the sky. The Overlord's massive ships still hung there, emitting a faint glow from their energy drives, but they weren't his immediate focus. Instead, he tuned his ears to a closer sound, a low electronic whine moving through the dense canopy. It was a small scout ship, no bigger than a human truck, its sleek metal hull studded with red glowing sensors sweeping the ground. This was the enemy's eye, dispatched to survey the terrain and pave the way for larger patrols. Marcus held his breath, pressing himself against an ancient tree, letting the shadows and thick fog cloak him from its probing beams. He didn't rush. Marcus watched the scout ship glide past at a steady pace, memorizing its trajectory. It followed a rigid, straight path, looping the same patrol route every 12 minutes, a clear sign of the Overlord's overconfidence. They didn't think anyone would dare resist, let alone study and exploit their weaknesses. Marcus waited until its third pass, when it neared his position again. He moved silently through the undergrowth, his steps as light as a stalking wolf's, leaving no sound but the rustle of leaves in the breeze. He'd lived in this forest long enough to become one with it, a shadow among shadows. As the scout ship swept by once more, Marcus struck. He sprang from the tree's cover, swift as an arrow, his steel wire whipping around the machine's narrow neck, a weak junction between its body and sensor array. With a fierce yank, he dragged it to the ground, his full strength pinning it down. The ship thrashed, its engine screeching in a bid to break free, but Marcus was ready. He plunged his dagger into a seam between its armored plates, where he guessed the power core lay. A burst of blue sparks erupted, the acrid stench of burning metal filling the air, and the ship went still, collapsing like a felled beast. Marcus stood over it, breathing evenly, checking for any distress signal. Nothing. He'd outpaced their alarms. Hauling the scout ship's wreckage back to his outpost, Marcus set to a more meticulous task. He laid it across an old wooden table in his small bunker, a feeble flashlight beam glinting off its metal shell. With calloused hands and the patience of a survivor, He dissected its circuits and components. He had no modern tools, just his dagger and an ancient screwdriver, but he pried it apart piece by piece. Inside, he found intricate wiring, hair-thin conduits pulsing faintly, and a compact, still-warm energy core. What caught his eye most was a small device at the ship's head, a transmitter emitting high-frequency waves, likely how they communicated with their larger forces. Marcus wasn't an engineer, but he'd learned adaptability on the alien frontiers. He carefully extracted the transmitter, rigging it to his crackling radio with scavenged copper wires. After a few minutes of tweaking, the static gave way to alien sounds, harsh, and human voices in a tongue he couldn't decipher. He didn't need to understand the words, he needed their intent. Hours of eavesdropping revealed they used fixed frequencies, sending brief updates on position and status. More crucially, he uncovered a fatal flaw. The Overlords moved in rigid formations, wholly reliant on tech for navigation, heedless of adapting to terrain or anticipating resistance. A cold smile curved Marcus's lips. This was their first mistake: arrogance. They thought superior might and advanced tech could crush all, but they hadn't reckoned with someone like him, a man with nothing but will and an intimate knowledge of his surroundings. He switched off the radio, stood, and peered out the outpost window. The darkness outside was thick, but he felt the forest as an extension of himself, every trail, every tree, every crevice a weapon he could wield. The Overlords had warships and energy cannons. Marcus had surprise, flexibility, and a resolve tempered by years of loss. He began planning. With a broken pencil and a scrap of paper, he sketched the scout ship's route, marking its recurring points. He knew they'd soon notice its absence and send more forces here. But instead of fleeing, Marcus resolved to make the forest his battlefield. A head-on fight was suicide. He'd strike from the shadows, a wolf hunting in the night. He checked his rifle, wiping the barrel with a torn rag, then strapped the wire around his waist. This was just the first step, but it would be a warning to the Overlords. Earth wasn't easy prey. Marcus stepped out, melding into the darkness, ready for the war he knew would shape the planet's fate. They'd underestimated him, and now they'd pay. Night fell over the forest like a heavy curtain, the faint glow from the Galactic Overlords ships piercing the canopy to cast weak streaks on the damp ground. Marcus Kane stood motionless in the dark, his steady breaths blending with the wind whistling through ancient branches. He was ready. After disabling the scout ship and cracking its signals, he was no longer a passive observer now. He was the predator, and this forest was his domain. The Overlords might wield superior power, but Marcus knew war wasn't just about weapons or numbers. It was a game of wits, patience, and leveraging every scrap of advantage. He started by setting traps along a narrow path he'd pinpointed through intercepted signals, a natural corridor between two rocky ridges, a route the Overlords' patrols used to control the outpost's surroundings. Marcus's traps were simple yet lethal, designed to exploit their arrogance and inflexibility. He strung thin ropes, nearly invisible in the gloom, across the path at ankle height, tied to massive boulders dangling from high branches. Below, he buried homemade mines, small explosive packets wrapped in rusted metal, triggered by the heavy tread of living armor. He lacked high-tech gear, but he knew how to maximize the primitive. A layer of dry leaves and twigs concealed his work, turning the path into a perfect, unsuspected death trap. When the first patrol arrived, Marcus hid behind a boulder, his M17 rifle propped on his shoulder, finger hovering over the trigger. The patrol was 5 Overlord soldiers, hulking figures in shimmering living armor, each weighing at least 300 kilograms, their steps shaking the earth. They didn't move randomly. They marched in a tight, mechanical line, 2 at the front bearing shoulder-mounted energy cannons, the rear 3 wielding long plasma swords that glowed in the dark. Their precision showcased their advanced tech, but it was also the weakness Marcus targeted. Too reliant on systems, too assured of their might, they ignored their surroundings. As the lead soldier snagged the rope, it all unfolded in a flash. A sharp crack rang out as the line snapped, dropping a boulder with terrifying speed. It crushed the front soldier, mangling his armor into a sparking heap, blue arcs flaring from his shattered core. Simultaneously, the first mine detonated, tearing the ground beneath the second soldier and hurling his bulk skyward before he crashed in a dust cloud. The remaining three panicked, red eyes scanning the dark, but debris blinded them. From his cover, Marcus fired, unflinching. 3 shots cracked in succession, each bullet striking the next seam he'd spotted on the scout ship. The soldiers crumpled, their cannons hum silenced, leaving the forest in a deadly hush. Marcus didn't pause to revel. He slipped from hiding, silently approaching the fallen patrol. He checked each body, ensuring no survivors, then scavenged their weapons. He hefted an energy cannon heavy, searing to the touch, with a faintly glowing blue core. He didn't know its workings yet, but he knew it outclassed his rifle 100-fold. He also claimed a plasma sword, testing its weight with a swing that sliced a thick branch effortlessly. These were his first taste of Overlord weaponry, and he felt their lethal potential. Soon, they'd turn against their makers. Word of the attack spread fast among the enemy. Through the radio linked to the transmitter, Marcus heard their harsh voices grow frantic, chaotic. They reported an unidentified force in the forest, none daring to admit it was one man. A commander's voice barked orders for more patrols and scouts. Marcus smirked. They were rattled for the first time in their conquests. They'd lost control. He memorized every detail, their reactions, their regrouping, their tactical rigidity. They feared the unexpected, making them more vulnerable than he'd thought. Resolved to escalate, Marcus turned the forest into a lethal labyrinth. He used its rugged terrain, slick slopes, narrow crevices, thick fog as his edge. He set more traps at key points, a pit masked with branches near a stream where patrols paused, ropes linked to oil-soaked wooden arrows, primed to ignite, and larger boulders perched on cliffs, ready to crush intruders. Each trap screamed that the Overlord's tech was useless against human ingenuity's brutal simplicity. That night, as another patrol entered, Marcus watched from afar. They moved slower, warier, but couldn't evade his snare. An explosion erupted, followed by a rock slide and the roars of armored figures buried alive. From the shadows, Marcus picked off survivors with precise shots. He felt no joy in killing, only the cold focus of a man fighting for Earth's survival. The Overlords had might, but Marcus had the forest, patience, and an unbreakable will they'd never comprehend. The war had just begun, and he'd make them pay for every inch they dared to tread. Days passed in the forest like a tense heartbeat, each moment a blend of waiting silence and sudden blasts that shook the air. Marcus Kane was no longer just a lone soldier in his own eyes. He'd become a phantom, a predator lurking in the dark, and to the Galactic Overlords, an uncontrollable threat. After those first ambushes, he didn't rest or grow complacent. Instead, he sharpened his tactics, making each day a fresh strike against their pride. The forest, with its hidden trails and dense canopy, wasn't just his refuge, it was the chessboard where he forced the Overlords to play by his rules. Marcus targeted their supply lines, a blow he knew would hurt more than felling a few patrols. From intercepted signals, he located a temporary weapons cache 10 kilometers east of his outpost, tucked in a small valley ringed by steep cliffs. It held energy munitions, spare plasma cores, and armor parts, lightly guarded because they thought no one would dare approach another misstep in their string of errors. Marcus trekked through the night, silent across icy streams and thorny brush, carrying the stolen energy cannon and his last homemade mines. Reaching the site, he perched on a high outcrop overlooking the valley. The cache was a low metal structure, aglow with blue light from stacked energy cores. A small team of 8 soldiers patrolled it, moving sluggishly, clearly expecting no trouble. Marcus watched for over an hour, noting their routine. Every 20 minutes, they shifted, leaving a brief gap at the southern end. His opening. He slithered down, body low, cloaked by darkness and fog. As the guards turned, he slipped through, planting mines at critical spots, one under the core pile, one by the main entrance, and one beside a flammable liquid tank he guessed fueled plasma cannons. His retreat was as quiet as his entry. Marcus climbed a nearby hill, clutching a crude detonator rigged from scout ship parts. He waited until the patrol neared the cache, then pressed the trigger. A deafening blast roared, followed by secondary explosions as the cores ignited, turning the valley into a blazing green inferno. Soldiers were flung skyward, their armor melting in the searing heat, their screams fading into the smoke. From his vantage, Marcus watched, his gaze icy and unwavering. This wasn't just a minor win, he'd severed a vital supply vein, stalling their war machine. News of the strike raced through the Overlords' radios. Marcus heard their voices shift from dry commands to furious, panicked shouts. A commander ordered more scouts and armored units to the area, but Marcus sensed it. Fear. They no longer trusted their grip. He seized the chaos, hacking their comms with the transmitter to broadcast a terse message on their main frequency. Earth isn't yours. I'm still here, and I'll make you pay. His voice was calm, frigid, emotionless, yet carried a weight that chilled any listener. That wasn't just a threat, it was a manifesto. The Overlords countered with more drones and towering war machines flooding the forest. But it only made Marcus grin faintly. The wider they spread, the more gaps they exposed. Their drones, with cutting-edge sensors, skimmed the canopy but couldn't spot him in the fog and rugged terrain. The war machines, though mighty, lumbered through the woods, snagging on roots or bogging in mud. Marcus turned their numbers against them, striking fast and vanishing before they could react. In another bold raid, he hit a temporary command post deep in the forest, hidden in a rocky cleft. He'd tracked it via radio for 2 days, memorizing guard shifts and power generator sites. Under a moonless night, he infiltrated through a narrow gap the Overlords ignored, too arrogant to think anyone would try it. Inside, he set explosives at 3 points: the main generator, a small armory, and a scout machine under repair. As he withdrew to a hilltop and dawn broke, he triggered the blast. The post erupted in a fireball, blinding light flooding the forest, metal shattering and soldiers roaring as they were trapped in the rubble. From the hill, Marcus surveyed the scene, his blue eyes blazing with unshakable resolve. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was Defiance incarnate, a living reminder that humanity wouldn't bow. The Overlords could burn the land, but not his spirit. They'd underestimated him, and now every explosion, every trap, every shot chipped away at their ironclad faith. From the command post's ashes, Marcus knew the tide was turning not by might, but by the indomitable will he carried, something the Overlords could never grasp. He slipped back into the shadows, ready for the next move, with a silent vow. They'd never take Earth, not while he stood. The forest was no longer a haven of peace, but a blazing war zone, where smoke and metal mingled with the wind's hiss through shredded trees. Marcus Kane stood atop a high outcrop, sharp eyes tracking blue energy streaks from the Galactic Overlords' cannons slicing the night sky. After countless successful ambushes, he'd driven them to desperation. Destroyed caches, shattered patrols, and raised command posts all bore his mark, a lone soldier against an alien empire. But Marcus knew small victories wouldn't end this war. The Overlords, though battered, still wielded overwhelming power, and they wouldn't retreat lightly. He sensed the turning point looming, a final clash to decide Earth's fate. Their desperation showed in their next move. From the outpost's ancient radio, Marcus caught a broadcast on every human frequency. A commander's harsh voice, stripped of its former cold arrogance, growled with menace. The lone resistor of humanity, surrender within 12 hours, or we'll level a major city as an example. Accompanying the threat were images from their colossal warships, towering machines hovering in the sky, massive energy cannons spinning, primed to unleash annihilation. They named no city, but Marcus knew it could be any survivor: London, Beijing, or a crowded southern plain. He clenched his jaw, hand tightening on the stolen energy cannon. This was their last gambit, using him to break humanity's will. But Marcus wouldn't yield. He knew the threat's true nature. Surrender wouldn't spare Earth, as they claimed. He'd seen it on other worlds and memories from frontier missions, planets stripped bare, people enslaved under metal heels. Giving himself up meant abandoning hope, dooming Earth to eternal darkness. Instead of bowing, he chose a response they'd least expect. He hooked the scout ship's transmitter to his radio, hacking their broadcast frequency. His voice cut through, steady and sharp as a blade. "You can burn the land, but not our will. I'm here, and I won't stop. Want me? Come find me." He severed the link, leaving a heavy silence on the airwaves, as if the cosmos held its breath. The Overlords answered with fury. They unleashed their elite force, Death Forgers, 10-meter war machines clad in the thickest living armor Marcus had seen. Each bore a massive plasma cannon on its shoulder, capable of flattening hills with energy orbs, and dual plasma swords twice a human's length, blazing in the dark. A squadron of smaller drones, armed with heat sensors and laser scans, buzzed overhead to pinpoint him. They were done with petty skirmishes. This was all-out war, a final bid to crush him and reclaim dominance. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd prepared for this. Days of observation and eavesdropping told him they'd throw everything at him, and he'd chosen a narrow western valley as his final stand. 2 kilometers long, flanked by sheer cliffs hundreds of meters high, its lone entrance was a tree-choked path. He spent the night rigging it. Magnetic mines buried to cling to living armor, large explosives tucked in rock crevices, linked by long fuses, and a complex pulley system suspending giant boulders atop the cliffs, poised for a devastating landslide. At the valley's heart, he piled oil-soaked branches as bait to lure them deeper. As the elite force marched in, Marcus crouched on a high ledge, energy cannon in hand, eyes locked on their movements. The Death Forgers trudged heavily, metal clashing echoing through the valley, while drones swept above, scanning with red lasers. They advanced slowly, more cautious than prior patrols, but Marcus knew their arrogance lingered. He waited, letting them reach the branch pile. When a forger fired a test plasma burst, flames roared, a thick smoke pillar blinding the entire unit. That was his cue. Marcus triggered the first magnetic mine. A blast roared, latching to a forger's leg, ripping its armor and toppling it. Next, he yanked the fuses, detonating the cliffside bombs. Explosions rocked the valley, rubble and dust flooding the air, sowing panic. Drones collided in the smoke, crashing like shot birds. Finally, he cut the pulleys, unleashing the boulders. They plummeted with monstrous force, smashing 2 forgers into twisted wrecks amid the chaos. In the smoky haze, Marcus leapt from cover, cannon blazing blue beams. He targeted the remaining forgers, each shot hitting their cores, erupting in brilliant fireballs. Accompanying soldiers resisted, but his left-hand plasma sword sliced their armor like butter. He moved fast, precise, a whirlwind of death in the mayhem. As the last forger fell, the valley stilled, save for crackling flames and cooling metal. Marcus stood amid the carnage, breath heavy but gaze steady. The Overlords' elite, their final pride, lay annihilated. It wasn't the end, but it was a mortal blow, proof Earth wasn't theirs to claim. He melted back into the dark, ready for whatever came next, with unshakable faith. As long as he stood, Earth would never fall. The Valley triumph wasn't just a military feat, it was the killing stroke that shattered the Galactic Overlords' resolve. After Marcus, Kane obliterated their Death Forgers, the enemy's ranks unraveled. Intercepted radio signals no longer carried stern orders or haughty threats, but panicked whispers and fierce arguments among commanders about the unseen predator who'd turned their easy conquest into a nightmare. Chaos spread as their massive warships began retreating from the atmosphere, abandoning the once proud war machines, now twisted hulks littering the ground in smoke and ash. They couldn't sustain the invasion, not from lack of resources, but because a single soldier had broken their spirit. From the ruins, humanity rose. Destroyed cities ceased to symbolize defeat, becoming beacons for rebuilding. Civilians, once huddled in fear, now seized arms from rusty rifles to plasma swords Marcus left behind and drove off the Overlord stragglers. Word of his victory spread through underground channels, fireside tales, and faint radio signals. They didn't know his name, but dubbed him the Green Phantom, a title evoking a warrior fused with the deep woods, invincible and unbowed. He became the spark igniting resistance, proving that even against overwhelming might, humanity could stand tall through grit and will. Marcus sought no glory, though. After the final clash, he retreated to his forest, back to his remote outpost like a true phantom. He didn't face crowds or accept medals. For him, the war wasn't about fame, but a silent oath he'd made to shield Earth, even if he stood alone on the edge of life and death. He lived among the ancient trees, hearing the wind and birds return after days of strife, feeling the peace he'd fought for. Yet his story didn't end there. It crossed Earth's borders, reaching distant worlds via human radio signals a warning. Don't come here, lest you share the Overlord's fate. Marcus's legacy wasn't in his deeds, but the defiance he passed on. Children grew up hearing of the Green Phantom, learning to shoot and trap not just to fight, but to grasp that true strength lay in an unyielding heart. Scientists studied Overlord tech from the wreckage, turning enemy weapons into humanity's next leap. Earth, once an easy mark, became a symbol of tenacity, a reminder that even the mightiest empires could fall to one who wouldn't quit. Marcus chose silence, but his mark echoed across the stars, an eternal testament to humanity not in tech or raw power, but in the unbreakable spirit of freedom and courage nothing could extinguish.